Gary Schoeniger is an internationally recognized thought leader in the field of entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial mindset in education. He's spoken to several various audiences, both here in the U.S. as well as internationally. Spent quite a bit of time in Latin America, which was fun to catch up and talk about that. And the contrast between what we do here in the United States and how entrepreneurship is viewed in Latin America, I thought was very interesting, and perhaps he'll highlight that a bit in his talks to us. But I think, how do we create that environment where innovation can grow from that spark that we've talked about, which is at the root of every innovative idea, is that spark and that creativity. How do we create that environment that will enable that to flourish and to grow? So with that, I'd like to introduce Gary and have him come up and speak with you next.
Thank you, Dwayne. I need to just do a quick transfer here. I hope all this works. Bear with me for just 1 second. Okay. How's that working? All right. I have podophobia also. Thank you, Edwina. Good morning, everyone. All right, good. So I'm honored to be here and share with you some of what I've learned about entrepreneurial thinking. I told Dr. Berlin that I'm working on a new book called Inside the Entrepreneurial Mindset, and so you're going to get sort of a new, some of the latest, greatest thinking around how to foster entrepreneurial thinking. The question I've been trying to answer for more than 20 years is, why does this small subset of the population engage in this behavior? Right? Have you seen the statistics from Gallup? Approximately 2/3 of U.S. workers are not engaged in their work. Students are not engaged either. The vast majority of the population is not engaged. But there's a small subset that's hyper-engaged. Why? What's going on there? Why is this small subset of the population so engaged? How can we be more entrepreneurial as individuals, innovative and entrepreneurial, and how can we support others? So they asked me to talk a little bit about makerspaces, creating the collaborative makerspace environments, a little bit about design thinking. How does this impact the curriculum, and what are the important, why are mentors important to this process? So, as I said, my questions are really the how and the why. What is it that innovators and entrepreneurs do? What does that process look like? And I think it's more important to understand, why are they doing this? What are the underlying psychological and situational factors that either encourage or inhibit this kind of behavior? And that's where most of my research is done. And we started to understanding the process. I began with the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in 2008 to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education curriculum in the United States. And we found a significant gap in the understanding, the way entrepreneurship is being characterized in classrooms, small business development centers, what have you, is largely disconnected from what entrepreneurs are actually doing. There's a huge disconnect there, so we need to get that right. And so, as a starting point, I think, as Gary said, all students need to understand the basics of innovation and entrepreneurship, where ideas come from, what do you do with an idea, like what does that really look like? We have to start with the process. But you can't really grab this without understanding the person. Right? The psychologist Kurt Lewin, I think in the 30s came, he's a German psychologist, and he's the one that sort of began the beginnings of social psychology, to understand a person's behavior is a function of both the person and the situation. And most of the intervention strategies that we've created ignore the situation and over-focus on the person. I'll talk a little bit about that. We seem to all be suffering from this fundamental attribution error. We're looking through our student populations for the next Mark Zuckerberg. and we're completely ignoring the situational factors that created Mark Zuckerberg in the first place. Right? So we need to understand the interplay between the person and the situation. And I'm going to argue this morning that the situation is far more impactful, influential than the individual's personality traits. But most importantly, we have to understand the situation. Right? We're organisms, we function in systems. Do those systems support or thwart a particular behavior? Very, very important aspect of this. So let's start with talking about the process. This has taken me 20 years to be able to articulate this in about 5 minutes. I'm borrowing from this concept called transformation theory. Anyone familiar with Dr. Land's work, Dr. George Land, Grow or Die? Anyone seen the TED Talk from Ken Robinson, Schools Kill Creativity? Yeah? All right, bravo. So that's where I found this research. He mentions breakpoint and beyond, right? That's Dr. Land's work. Dr. Land is the guy that did the creativity study that Ken Robinson talks about, where kids go at 5 years old, they study, 98% of them score genius level at creativity, 5-year-olds. 98% of them. Did you ever hear the story? Dr. Land was asked by NASA to develop a survey that would allow NASA to identify the most creative scientists at NASA so they could give them their most difficult projects, right? And Land created this survey. He gave it to NASA. He said it worked quite well. They identified that 2% of the scientists at NASA scored genius level on his creativity study. Bravo. He's feeling all, proud of himself. And then he goes home and has this idea. What if we gave this exam to a bunch of 5-year-olds? So he administers this same creativity study to 1,600 5-year-old kids. Guess what happens? 98% of them score genius level. The exact opposite. 5-year-olds. Then he said, what happens if we make this a longitudinal study? 5 years on, when this 1,600 kids are now 10 years old, what happened? They went from 98 to 30%. They gave it again when they were 15. They went from 30% to 12%. 270,000 adults have been given this test. And where are we? We're at 2%. One of the conclusions that Land came away with is that non-creative behavior is learned. And what I'm going to argue this morning is that non-entrepreneurial behavior is also learned. And an important factor that Gary brought up in his talk, one of the things that Land took away from the creativity study, or that I'll highlight in transformation theory, is that nothing fails like success. Right? At the same time as the things we're doing that are leading to our success, at the same time we're undermining our future. So let me tick through this very quickly. Transformation theory, also put forth by Dr. George Land to explain the nature of change within systems. Okay? Let's go to Biology 101. What he's saying, there's a search phase, there's a growth phase, and there's an obsolescence phase. There's no getting around those three factors. That's the natural the nature of the system. And what he's saying is that while you can't avoid these three phases, he's saying that each of these three phases requires separate rules for survival. And the trick is to know which phase you are in so you know which rules to apply. In your spare time, look up the word maladaptive. It's the tendency to cling to what's once worked and ignore the changes in the situation and the environment. That's the definition of maladaptive. So bear with me here, right? These are the breakpoints that Ken Robinson was talking about. These little dots represent the moment in time when the rules for survival change, right? So let's talk about the search phase. Let me begin with that. What are we searching for? In traditional terms, we're searching for our first real job, our vocation or our career, right? We get a degree, we go to school, we get a degree, we find our first real job, bravo. We know what we're going to do, the searching is over, and that's that. So in the entrepreneurial, innovative context, what are we searching for? We're searching for the intersection between our own interests and abilities and the needs of our fellow human. I heard this once described as what makes our hearts sing and what humans need. We find those intersect. When we find that intersection, human flourishing occurs. I also want to point out in the search phase the context that we always forget to consider. The yellow bar, lots of uncertainty. The green bar, resource limited. Right? Limited resources, lots of ambiguity and uncertainty. What do human beings hate more than anything in the world? Uncertainty and ambiguity. Anyone read Kahneman? Right? The extent to which we will make decisions against our own self-interest to avoid the discomfort of ambiguity. Are we aware of this? No, we're not. Those are called cognitive biases, right? We'll do anything to avoid this. The nature of the search occurs in a resource-constrained, ambiguous environment that's not incidental or accidental. It's a very important piece of the puzzle. And I'll explain why in a minute. The attitudes, behaviors, and skills required for search are skills that anyone can learn to develop. They're simply skills that most of us have never had a chance to develop and hone. Right? Drucker said this 30 years ago. Entrepreneurship's a discipline. Anybody can learn it. Repetition and practice and feedback, right? Just like anything else. I'll get into that in a little more detail later. Once we find that little orange dot, right? Once we get to that intersection, and we know we're at that intersection because we have evidence that we have found a problem-solution fit. We have evidence that we found the intersection between our own needs and the needs of our fellow human. Our own interest and the needs of our fellow human. Now, that evidence can come in many forms. The most common form is currency. When people are paying for what it is we've created, we have evidence. This is the scientific method. It's nothing more than that. Entrepreneurship is not about forecasting. It's not about looking in a crystal ball. It's the scientific method. We're looking for evidence of a problem-solution fit. Once we have evidence of that, the search or the discovery skills become less relevant. Now we need management skills, right? It's very, very rare that a person that becomes very adept at the search can morph into the CEO managerial skills. Some of the experienced entrepreneurs, they either sell in the early stage or they hire managers. They understand the distinction. It's not often that people can morph from being highly adept at discovery skills and flip into becoming managers. What's happening? The ambiguity is starting to come down because we know who's buying and why they're buying. We know that left-handed, female tennis players are buying our new product. We know why they're buying it, right? And the resource axis is going up. Where's the locus of control in each of these two situations? In the search phase, the locus of control, it's up to a few people. There's an underpinning. There's an unspoken, largely tacit assumption that Connor will tell you this. It's up to me and my founders to figure this out because no one's in charge, the rules are not clear, and no one's coming to rescue, right? So the locus of control is naturally internal, intrinsic. It's just natural. What happens in the growth and the management phase where Adam Smith steps in, the division of labor starts to happen? The locus of control is likely to be external. It's another important factor. Not going to dive into it now. Eventually, a second break point occurs. Right? Shift happens. Right? The situation changes, and we know we hit the second break point because our growth. In phase 2, the system stops searching and starts replicating. It replicates what it found in phase 1. Stop searching, start replicating in order for the system to grow. That's management, that's the division of labor. Fair enough. Eventually, we hit the second break point and we know we're there because the growth starts to slow. Right? It's not happening the way it was. We start to get a whiff of something's different, something's changing, the growth's not. The environmental changes can be policy, regulatory, climatic, competitive, disruptive, what have you. Shift happens, right? When we hit the third phase, ideally what Land is saying is that a new S-curve should begin. We recognize that the environment has changed and we too must change. Doesn't always happen that way, does it? Right? Very often it does not happen because as a system we've grown. We've enjoyed this period of growth and we develop sort of this arrogance. I don't have a better word for it, I'm sorry. We develop an assumption of complete knowledge, right? And we tend to deny the changes in the environment, right? There are many other factors. You know, people like to talk about Kodak being blind to digital photography. It's not the case. Kodak invented digital photography. The case is they were clinging to a very profitable business model, unwilling to let go of that business model to explore the new. In a perfect world, we recognize the environment has changed, the situation has changed, so too we must change. In a perfect world, that's what happens. If that doesn't happen, the system will perish. It will continue into obsolescence and perish. Right? So hopefully, we recognize this, the environment has changed, we too must change. Look what's happened. The system has grown, has access to resources, right? The uncertainty has all but disappeared. But the situation is different. This is what we learn in business school. How to help large established organizations innovate. All I'm saying here is there's a distinction between the attitudes, behaviors, and skills. There's access to resources. There's lots of experts, right? There's a diffusion of responsibility across an organization. I'll be happy to share the slides afterwards. Simple definition of entrepreneurship, it's a discovery process. We're searching for the intersection between our own interests and abilities and the needs of our fellow human being. That's simple. I'm going to just keep it simple for now. So 3 phases of discovery. Last year when I was here, I got into a discussion with a guy who said, we should keep innovation and entrepreneurship separate. And help me understand why. Don't we already have an enormous tech transfer problem at most universities? Right? And so I think by taking the entrepreneurial component, I would say that problem finding and problem solving are really about innovation. And I want to highlight problem finding because not many people are talking about problem finding. This is new stuff coming out of UC Berkeley. Problem finding trumps problem solving. Right? Finding the right problem, finding the tacit, unarticulated needs. Run, don't walk to Amazon and buy Clayton Christensen's new book, Competing Against Luck. We're really good at understanding the functional dimensions of a product or a service, but we're horrible at understanding the social and emotional dimensions. And if all we did was buy things based on functional dimensions, we'd all be driving Corollas, right? But communicating, bringing an idea, communicating and advocating for an idea, that's a whole nother kettle of crazy. You know, Richard Branson, he and I spoke, I got the chance to meet him and speak at the same conference in Mexico a few months ago. You know what he said? He said, you know, ideas are like trains. If you opportunities, you miss this one, there'll be another one along in 20 minutes. Right? It's what to do with an idea. Are you committed to that idea? Are you a parent that's going to bring that idea to life, to adulthood? That takes a whole different set of attitudes, behaviors, and skills that have very little or anything to do with innovation. So there's this phenomenon happening at universities all around the United States, and I came up with a name for it. I call it SVCD. It's the Silicon Valley Cognitive Disorder. Right? It's a mental, it's a cognitive bias that, you know, we're over-informed by the Silicon Valley narrative. And if you look closely what's happening in Silicon Valley narrative, in Silicon Valley startup space, it's usually like really brilliant people with decades of industry experience bringing, you know, highly complex things to life. I work with the Kauffman Foundation. The former head of research, Dane Stangler, told me that it's 0.018 is the percentage of new companies created in the United States are funded with venture capital. It's a fraction of a single percent. Bill Aulett at MIT and others are starting to sound the alarm bells about the Silicon Valley cognitive disorder, pushing students prematurely towards funding before they validated the idea. We're teaching kids that ideas are like lottery tickets. If you just build the right app, you're going to be an overnight millionaire. It's the wrong message to be sending. So let's talk a little bit about the person. What are the underlying beliefs and assumptions, the knowledge structures and the cognitive processes that drive the behavior, the mental models and the beliefs that drive the behavior? I look to a guy named Edgar Schein from MIT who studied culture. I've spent the last 10 years interviewing hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs across the globe, all over Latin America, Eastern Europe, South Africa, the UK, all over the United States. I've probably interviewed near 500 entrepreneurs in an ethnographic 90-minute, 2-hour interview. Here's what we've learned. On the surface are the visible artifacts and the observable behavior. Right? We see the business, we see the car, we see the success, we hear the entrepreneurs say what they're saying. Beneath the surface is their explicit or their declarative knowledge, what they're able to tell you they know. You know, I interview a guy who sold his t-shirt printing business for $60 million. He said, the only reason I agreed to do this interview is because I can't even explain to my own children how I did what I did. Right? And you interview a successful entrepreneur, a guy just sold his business, just had a big exit, lots of, media attention, people interviewing this person, and you don't get much meaningful, if you don't know how to ask the right questions, you don't get meaningful data. You borrowed $5,000 from your mother-in-law 25 years ago, you just sold your business for $250 million, my God, how did you do that? I worked really hard and I didn't give up. Right? There's not a lot of useful takeaway there. What we found is that there's implicit knowledge, the procedural knowledge, right? That the entrepreneurs acquired implicitly without effort or awareness. They don't know what they know. There's these deeply held tacit assumptions, taken for granted beliefs and assumptions that are the true source of their behavior. So why do entrepreneurs do what they do? Do you ever ask yourself this question? What is driving this behavior? Most of us default to it's a trait. There's some sort of hereditary trait, right? It's just sort of this fuzzy little leap we make that you either have or you don't have. Part of our research, I won't get into this, look at the work of Deci and Ryan in self-determination theory. Our basic psychological needs are for autonomy, for competence, and relatedness. We need to feel like we matter to other people. We need to become competent or develop a mastery in something, and we need to function autonomously. We're organisms functioning in a system, and when these basic psychological, when the environment does not support these basic psychological needs, we look to need substitutes, right? So it's a natural inclination towards these things, this natural desire towards autonomy and mastery and purpose. Deci and Ryan are also the guys that have basically figured out intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And we know from a broad array of studies that people who are intrinsically motivated, meaning the task itself is the reward, will outperform across domains people that are extrinsically motivated by the utility of a task, whether it's letter grades, gold stars, dollars, what have you. So when people are intrinsically motivated, they'll outperform people. I think it was Dan who said this morning that it's not about the money. In my interviewing entrepreneurs, I kept hearing these people say it's not about the money. And I would think to myself, you just sold your company for $500 million. That's survivor's guilt, or that's some kind of, it's easy for you to say, I'd be thinking to myself, right? But I heard it enough and I kept digging into the psychological literature, and that's what I realized, it's really not. They're trying to express something really important. It's much, much more powerful than the money. So let's talk about the situation. Like what are the social, the environmental, and the situational factors that either encourage or inhibit entrepreneurial behavior? This is the technical definition of the fundamental attribution error. For those of you who want to geek out on this stuff, Nisbet and Ross' books called The Person and the Situation will illuminate this with much more clarity. But it's the tendency to overemphasize the importance of a person's hereditary traits while ignoring or underappreciating the situational factors or the person's construal of those factors. So let me talk about that just briefly. We talk about entrepreneurship as a discovery process, a searching process, right? These are 4 invisible factors that help explain the behavior. The nature of the goal pursued. How many of you, this is a rhetorical question, so don't answer me. How many of you have a compelling goal? Gary, I know you do because you got the gray hair to prove it. How many of you have a compelling goal, something that has captured your imagination, something that's out of your reach, something that engages all of your faculties? You think about it when you wake up, you think about it when you go to sleep, you think about it on Sunday morning and Monday morning. The question I want to ask you is, if not, why not? Right? The hashtag is learned helplessness. Right? If all we're doing is going to our jobs to collect a paycheck to try to get to retirement, we're going to be motivated, we're going to behave very, very differently than if we're pursuing a compelling goal. It's just a game changer. So let's stop looking at a person's individual traits and start looking at these situational factors. Our job as educators is to figure out for the students, what is that intersection? As Jaime Casap, the head of Google Education, says, stop asking your students what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them, what problems do you want to solve? And what do you need to learn in order to solve those problems? In the absence of a compelling goal, you are just not likely to bring all your gifts to your fellow human. It's just not likely to happen. So that's really, in my view, the most important and often overlooked factor. Then let's look at the ambiguous and uncertain nature, right? This is where the Buddhist saying comes into play, right? The minds of the expert, the opportunities are few, and the minds of the novice, they are many. Right? The ambiguity and the uncertainty makes you willing to try new things. You don't really know what's going on. So you're not immersed in a belief system, in a cultural belief system. Right? Why is 16-year-old Bill Gates see something that IBM can't? The resource-constrained nature of the search is also muy importante. Right? Giving people money in the search phase is a horrible idea. We see this all the time, right? You get a bunch of funding and you start going home at 5 o'clock. You buy new computers and a new car and a cool workspace, and you still haven't validated the idea. Right? And lastly, look at the self-directed nature of the search. We keep inserting ourselves in the process. We keep undercutting the student's ability to develop their own innovative and entrepreneurial attitude and culture. I'm going to tick through these final things very quickly. So this comes to, what does this mean to the curriculum? Part of what we've looked at is, I've studied entrepreneurs in the wild. Right? And we forget that people were learning for thousands, millennia, before we ever had books and characters and symbols and words. People were learning. Right? So we've studied entrepreneurs and how they learn in the wild, right? It's like going on a game drive with binoculars. Like what are they doing naturally without instruction? Couple of key points. It's situated learning. Not going to happen in a classroom. I mean, some knowledge can be transferred in the classroom, I get it. But it's situated. We have to be in the experience. The simulation, maybe not so much. It's situated learning. It's facilitated rather than instructed. Right? We have to remove the presence of an authority figure. We have to create the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. Boy, oh boy, this is a big one, and it's messy, but most of what entrepreneurs learn, they learn implicitly. Look at the research on implicit learning. Arthur Reber is kind of the guy that came forth with this in the 60s. Our brains have an enormous capacity to learn without effort or awareness. By the time you were 4 or 5 years old, you fully well understood the rules of grammar in your native language. And most of you still can't articulate those rules to this day, right? That's an example of implicit learning. Our brains have an enormous capacity to learn without effort or awareness. It turns out implicit learning is far more robust than explicit learning. It's IQ independent. Your dog can do it as well as you can. The knowledge that we acquire from implicit learning is tacit, right? I know it, but I'm unable to say it. This is the mentoring thing, right? The best way to transfer tacit knowledge is through face-to-face interaction over a long period of time with trusted relationships. Look at the literature on tacit learning. And another guy there is Gary Klein. It's constructivist. Right? It's building, it's learning, it's emphasizing active engagement through strategies. It's talking, not just listening, writing, not just reading, interaction, problem solving. Look at the Montessori Mafia. That's the result of constructivist learning as opposed to behaviorist learning. So what we've found is that entrepreneurs learn, basically they're doing 4 things that are very well known to educators. They're doing experiential learning. It's problem-based learning, a little bit different from project-based. It's peer-to-peer learning and it's self-directed learning. Let me tick through this. Experiential learning, emphasizing process over content. The likelihood that your students are going to get up to the plate at 20 years old, and the first time they swing a bat, they're going to get on a base, let alone hit a home run, is almost zero. Right? This is a numbers thing. It's a number of times at bat. So emphasizing the process is more important. You guys pretty much have this design thinking stuff down. We owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Steve Blank and Bob Dorff and Eric Ries and Alexander Osterwalder. You guys, most of us understand the processes pretty well. I want to talk about problem-based learning in that it's student-centered. They pick the problem. We don't assign them the problem. That's the fundamental difference between project-based and problem-based. Occurs in small groups. Teacher is a facilitator, not the leader, not the authority figure. The problems are in as early, they stimulate problem-solving skills, and the knowledge is obtained from that. What's important is the ill-structured nature of the problem requires more information for understanding than is initially available, multiple solution paths. The solution changes as new information. It prevents students from knowing they've made the right decision. What do I got to do to get the A goes out the window. We hear this all the time with our curriculum when it's deployed. The students are pissed off. Not only are you not going to tell me where to find the answers, you're not even going to tell me what the problem is. They feel cheated. They feel like you're not giving them your money's worth. Generates interest and controversy, causes them to learn to ask more questions. It's open-ended enough to require collaboration, think beyond recall. The ill-structured nature of the problem is where metacognition occurs. Look at the literature from Haney and others. The metacognitive abilities that have been measured in experienced entrepreneurs are very different from managers. who have learned to work and think in very stable environments. Peer-to-peer learning. Mazur is the guy at Harvard that kind of brought this forward. There's a peer-to-peer learning thing that happens naturally with entrepreneurs. They're teaching each other. There's a self-directed component. And for the students who come in as undergrads, most of them are dependent learners. Right? There's a guy named Alfie Kohn. He's somewhat of an academic rebel. He tweeted something the other day I got a kick out of. He said, "What's the worst possible way to teach kids how to be innovative and entrepreneurial? Have them follow everybody else's rules all their life." Right? It's like, duh. So Gerald Groh kind of helped us understand how to move a dependent learner through these stages into an interested, involved, and ultimately self-directed learner. So wrapping up very quickly, most of my research, as you can see, is in psychology and social sciences to understand how and why entrepreneurs do. Perhaps the most profound and just wrapping all of this up is the work of Albert Bandura in self-efficacy. Do you guys know what that term means? Self-efficacy is not self-esteem or self-worth. Bandura describes it as domain-specific confidence. You can have very high efficacy as a professor, very low self-efficacy, perceived self-efficacy as an entrepreneur. It's domain-specific confidence, right? He's the guy that came up with a guided mastery. 4 key things you need to help move someone from a helpless to a mastery orientation. 4 key things. We need an early efficacy experience. And what that means is I need to feel the bat hit the ball. And that efficacy experience needs to be somewhat hard won. If it comes too easy, the person's likely to give up when it becomes difficult. And oh, will it get difficult. Right? So we need some inclination that it's possible for me to get to first base. Bandura calls this an early efficacy experience. Second thing is we need relatable social models. That's what the worker space are for. That's what the weekly meetings and the talks and hearing from other entrepreneurs. I need to see people who I can relate to, who have come from similar or worse circumstances succeeding in this domain. So let's stop using lottery winners as examples of entrepreneurs. Let's start putting forth everyday relatable models that students can relate to. You need a mentor. You need somebody that'll coach you, that you trust, that will help you dig deeper, run faster, and jump higher. And good mentoring is difficult to come by. Our SBDCs are populated with well-intentioned managers from the 90s who can't distinguish from column 3 to column 1. You want to start a little business? Great, we're going to treat your startup as if it's just a smaller version of a large corporation. And out comes the 30-page business plan and so forth. Right? We need good mentors who will just ask good questions. And we need the ability to regulate our emotions. Here's why that's important. When we're asking students to be innovative and entrepreneurial, we're asking them to deviate from their own behavioral norms, from their family, cultural, norms, from societal norms. We're asking them to deviate. Next time you get on an elevator, when there's other people on the elevator, I defy you to walk to the back of the elevator and face the back wall. Right? Don't forget that you're asking your students to deviate from the cultural, behavioral norms of everyone around them when you're asking them to innovate. Right? So, I'm going to tell a 1-minute story and I'm done. How many of you are familiar with Atul Gawande? Run, don't walk to the bookstore, look him up. He's a surgeon from Harvard that writes about innovation. And I read this story in the New Yorker some years ago called Slow Ideas. And he said in the mid-19th century, 2 important ideas emerged in medicine. The first is the idea that we could anesthetize you. during surgery. And surgery goes from a horrifically violent, shrieking, unimaginably painful experience, and violent for the surgeon, painful for the patient experience, to calm and deliberate, relatively painless. I think it started with a dentist figured it out initially. But this idea basically took off overnight, spread across Europe, virtually overnight. The second idea that emerged about a decade or so later is the idea that surgeons are killing our patients. We're killing our patients by infecting them with germs that are on our blood-caked smocks, on our gloves, on our instruments, on our neckties. And so this guy named Listerine, starts to convince doctors to douse themselves in carbolic acid, which was painful, which was, just inconvenient, but it started to work. The mortality rate started to come down from infection, from surgery. That idea took 30 years to catch on. So I'm asking you, which of those two ideas is more important to humanity? Right? Who's to say? The first idea took off overnight because the benefit to the doctor, to the surgeon, was both immediate and obvious. In Lister's case, it was neither. Right? It was neither. The need to change, the academic, the institutional immunity to change is not going to be an easy problem to fix. Right? And in many ways, we're infecting our students with old ideas. But the benefits to us as educators, to the system, are not immediate or obvious. And so, the other side of the coin is, look at the Stanford prison experiments. They turn a classroom into a prison cell, simulated prison that transforms 24 relatively psychologically healthy young students into sadistic monsters in about 5 days. Certainly we can turn a classroom into the incubators, into the maker spaces where the collaboration and outsiders coming in and relatable social models. We can help educators and students understand and embrace these ideas. Thank you.